Everybody's got a story. You just have to listen. Well, I'm Joe Pardavila, and this is Good Listen. And I don't know if it's because I'm getting older, but getting slightly obsessed with the idea of time and wasting time. You know that old adage, the days are getting longer, but the years are getting shorter. Well, today I think my guest might be slightly obsessed with time, too. His name is Oliver Burkeman. He's a British author, columnist, and journalist who you might know as the author of 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals, which is the self-help book built around the philosophy and psychology of time management and happiness. Well, we're going to get into our dysfunctional relationship with time and his latest book, Meditations for Mortals, 4 Weeks to Embrace Your Limitations and Make Time for What Counts. Oliver, welcome to Good Listen. How are you?
I'm doing very well. How are you doing?
I'm doing excellent. And so the reason I have you on the show today is for really selfish reasons. I have been on this high horse, this kick for the last 2 years about the busyness epidemic. The world is so busy. We're so busy. And I like to joke that the 90s were all about being tired. Oh, we're tired all the time. And I think that's why Starbucks exploded, because everyone needed caffeine because everyone was tired. But now all of a sudden, everyone's busy. They're too busy to do this, too busy to do that. What happened to us? Why are we so freaking busy in 2024?
Well, I think there are lots of different reasons, but a couple of them, and they're all part of the same thing, are, firstly, we live in this world of kind of infinite inputs, as I call it, right? So there's no limit to the number of emails you could receive, the number of demands you could feel have made of you, the number of ambitions you might have, things you want to launch. And so as our sort of technologies allow us to move through these things faster and faster, we get better and better at moving through these infinite supplies, but we don't get to the end of them because that's not how infinity works, right? So you just get sort of more and more stressed and anxious, and your life fills up with more and more stuff. And, if you get really good at answering emails, as everyone knows, the reward for that is you just get loads more emails that you then have to get even better at answering. Right. At the same time, I think there is a kind of a social status attached to it, right? There's a sort of unavoidable sense that, well, I'd rather be too busy than insufficiently busy, and there's a kind of a payoff if you're sort of pulled all over the place and feeling terribly overwhelmed. It's not nice, it's not fun, but at least you matter in some sense, right?
Yeah. And on a societal point, one of the things I often laughed about is the fact that busyness is seen as this sort of like shield and this status of like when you ask someone a question, hey, are you able to do this? And the person responds, I'm busy. It's this automatic like drop the gauntlet. It's the record needle scratch. It's like, oh, this person's busy. I can't possibly bother this person because they are quote unquote busy. Yeah. As you can tell, I'm passionate about this, Oliver.
Yeah, I think it has just become a sort of a catch-all phrase, and the real truth of it is just that we're finite humans, and the number of things we could do is infinite. So everyone's always everyone's always completely busy on some level, right? And yeah, that's the same as saying that nobody's busy. I mean, we all we can do in any moment is make the best choices about how to use the next hour and the next hour and the next hour, and let all the rest fall by the wayside.
Yeah, it's interesting when there was like that fad a few years ago, Oliver, and I know you keep up with stuff like this, but like remember when the power of no, like take back your life by saying no, and I feel like that's almost permeated to almost like a sort of to have negative effects, because all of a sudden it's like if you say no to everything, you're never going to try something new or experience something or take a risk. And so let's talk about that a little bit, about this whole, it was actually kind of like this whole cottage industry of the power of no. There were books and podcasts all about it, but this idea of like saying no, but then sort of confining yourself from trying other things or doing new experiences, something else new.
I mean, I think I'm going to sort of half agree with you and half disagree. I think that the power of saying no and the power of saying yes are kind of completely intertwined with each other. And it's again for the same reasons that I'm sort of going on about here. We are always effectively saying no in any moment to a million things, because that's the nature of making choices with time, right? If you're going to spend couple of hours catching up with a good friend, you're not spending that couple of hours getting on top of your email inbox. And so the ability to sort of say no to the lure of email, for example, in that case, or to some other demand that you don't want to do, is crucial to being able to spend the time with a friend. But you have to know what you want to say yes to. You have to be able to be doing both of these things. And yeah, when it comes to trying things that are new, I don't think that the real power of saying no is about a sort of a defense mechanism against the anxiety that is involved in new things. That's the kind of thing to consider saying yes to. I think it really is that, it's that sense of, well, in every moment we're saying no and saying yes. And the question is, are we going to do it consciously?
Yeah, that was the point I was getting to, Oliver, was the fact that a lot of folks, and I used to work, and I'm sure you know people who used to work with them. It's like the no before yes people, like before the even, the question is actually out of your mouth, the person's already thinking no first. And I think that's the mindset I want people to break free from. Yeah, yes, say no what you want. You know, obviously we talked about the finite amount of time, but the idea of like your automatic knee jerk is no. I think that's the cycle people need to break, just for their own personal development, right?
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. I think, I mean, it's incredibly important to be willing to let things into your life that are not familiar to you, because otherwise there can be no novelty and no progress.
Yeah. And let's talk about like your journey to becoming this sort of personal development guru. I know for years self-help was like the word, and then all of a sudden I think someone stood up and was like, I don't like that. And I know some of your stuff says self-help, but like this idea of personal development and helping people become better people. And I often say, Oliver, that we can't change, but we can improve. We're sort of like a human iPhone. Like we can improve our software every few years by either education, by interactions with other people. So how did this journey start with you, where you wanted to help people, you know, on their personal growth path?
I mean, to be honest, to this day, all I really feel like I'm doing is figuring stuff out for myself and sharing it as I go along. I'm not offended by being a self-help guru or something, but I don't think of myself in any such terms, because I think all I'm doing in my writing really is figuring out what seems most urgent to me, grappling with it, and sort of passing on what I learned. So really what I'm doing is a kind of very public form of therapy, really. What I'm always struck by is how helpful that seems to be for people, right? And this is true for me as well, right? We don't want to hear from people who are claiming to be completely perfect at everything. That's just not, it's dishonest. Nobody believes it in the first place. If you actually say, you know, as I try to, look, yeah, I know what it is to feel overwhelmed by stuff, and here's what I think is going on. Partly that's useful because you can sort of share some tips and tricks that have worked, but it's also useful just because there's something really empowering about being like, yeah, we are all in this boat today in the 21st century. It's not just you, as it were. And I think there's a lot of power in that.
Were you intentional with this? Like, was this something where you stumbled onto this idea of being able to help people through your pain or through the stuff that you suffered with? Was it intentional, or was it unintentional?
Well, it's sort of a mixture, because I've always been a writer, and that's the thing I do, and I do it even when it's, you know, outside of my work. I make sense of things by writing about them, whether in a journal or whether in sort of public forums. And so what happens if you do that, and you do it a lot, is that you will just naturally start, by the sort of, you know, law of large numbers or whatever, start producing things that sort of resonate with people in different ways. Now, I wouldn't say it was a really detailed plan to do this, but one of the amazing things about, you know, the digital economy and having an email newsletter and all of this stuff is just that you reach those people, right? If there's 10,000 people on the planet who find my particular stuff useful, who share my sort of particular weird issues and benefit from what I've got to say about them, you're going to find them. It wasn't that way when I worked on a newspaper for many years. There you really have to appeal to like anybody who could be picking up that newspaper. But I think it's it's a sort of unfolding journey. But no, I anytime I've made really detailed plans for my future, they've borne no resemblance to what ends up happening.
That's awesome. For many years, I worked in morning radio in New York City, and every day you would talk about like stuff that was in the news, pop culture, and everything like that. But and this is something that I stumbled upon is like, as much as you talk about stuff that people want to talk about, no one really connects with you until it's a personal thing. Like until you share a story about the a run-in you had at a store or a traffic incident. It's funny how we all connect, and I know storytellers have this sort of been the idea from the caveman of sharing stories and people being entertained by it. But when did you realize that your words had an impact on people? Because like I said, when I was doing the radio, like I figured, people were listening because we saw ratings, but we didn't see the actual sort of like the soft tissue stuff until we started talking about our own personal life.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I've been writing for ages. I was sort of making little like amateur newsletters to force my schoolmates to read when I was a kid. I've been doing this for ages. but there's a big difference. I worked in sort of old media newspapers for a long time, and there you definitely get feedback. You definitely get people responding, and it resonates. But it's much less sort of direct, and most people don't feel moved to respond to any given column. And half of this was like pre-internet anyway. The email newsletter is when I've really been able to understand that what it is that I'm writing that is helpful to people, because then there's something strangely intimate about email. There kind of shouldn't be somehow. I don't understand it, but like once someone has said yes, you are allowed to send your email to my inbox, they're liable to sort of take it seriously and look at it. And that's when I've found that I've really sort of connected with people. I think that a lot of the world of productivity advice and self-help advice and all the rest of it, it's all ultimately to do with kind of maintaining this kind of fake facade that everyone's doing great, that everyone's happy, that everyone's on the path to the very next goal, and it's all brilliant. And if you just come along and say, actually, it's a little different than that, and it's not depressing, it's not about giving up, but it is about seeing the ways in which we're actually limited, and the fact that we have to sort of lean into those limitations, and the fact that you're not going to get to do everything. You're going to die with a really long to-do list, because that's just what it means to be a human. As soon as you actually say that, a lot of people are like, breathe a huge sigh of relief, and are keen to read about it more and to talk about it more, just because it's like, oh yeah, this is actually how it really is.
How much did you see this wave turn of the emphatic leader, having empathy with the pandemic? One of the things I noticed with the pandemic is no one knew what empathy was until like a global disease hit the world. Then all of a sudden you're seeing these CEOs talking about being empathetic and feeling what their employees are feeling. And so how about that? Like the idea that all of a sudden the word empathy just was like reborn in 2020.
It's interesting. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure some of it was real, some of it. That was a very big deal, and there was a lot of awful stuff going on. But I think that organizations for a long time have been looking for, try to find the thing that will make people loyal to the organizations, right? And for a long time, there was a long spell when there was a great focus on trying to make it sort of actively fun to be in the workplace. Very few things more agonizing and unpleasant than organized fun. And I think a lot of that didn't really work. And empathy, it's great if your boss is empathetic about your situation, but it's probably greater if your boss gives you a pay rise. It's like I think that what you're seeing in a lot of the decisions that people make about their work and changes they make to their careers and stuff is that kind of realization that time is limited, and at some point you'd better do something that makes you feel alive rather than just sort of pleases other people. Yeah.
And that sort of led to a lot of the work you've done recently. In 2021, you had the book 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals, and that's going to lead us to your next book in a moment. But let's talk about time management. We sort of opened up this conversation talking about the fact that we're all busy and we just love being busy. What are some of the reasons that led you to that, and why do you think we're so bad at time management?
Well, when I wrote that book, I really wanted to sort of take seriously, like, okay, time management is this idea that feels a bit thin and a bit cheesy. It's just sort of like, morning routines and daily schedules. But really, when you think about it, it's like the biggest question that there is in a human life. We've got this short amount of time. How are we going to be more conscious about choosing what to do with it? The short answer to why I think we're so bad at that is that we're not really, most of the time, trying to use the time that we have as wisely and as meaningfully as possible. We're actually trying to make ourselves feel like we don't have limited time. We're trying to sort of play some emotional trick on ourselves where we don't have to feel what it's like to be a human with limited time and tough choices to make about that time. So a lot of kind of optimization focused productivity stuff, efficiency stuff is all about doing more and more and more and more in the same amount of time. Supposedly, I guess, to get to some point where you're doing enough and then you can do everything and you never need to worry because you're efficient enough to do it all. But as we've discussed, that time is never coming. So I think it's all kind of like a fantasy that, just to get completely sort of deep and philosophical about it, is ultimately about us not wanting to be mortal, not wanting to die, right? We sort of want to get more and more and more capacity for doing more and more and more things. And what I'm always saying is that will never lead you to peace of mind. It can be useful, sure, to learn how to do things faster. I'm not against it. The only thing that will really lead you to a feeling of like, now I'm managing my time well, is getting better at making those choices about what to do and what to neglect, and being willing to not do things in order to do other things. Because if you're just trying to do more and more, then there'll always be even more for you to try to do, and it will never end. That treadmill will never end.
And I don't want to spend the next few minutes shitting on technology, but let's shit on technology for a few minutes. And that is the idea of the distractions. You talked about, earlier about the fact that, we're always connected to our technology, whether it comes to, responding to emails and such. But think about all the other distractions, like YouTube. Someone may be watching this right now on YouTube, and thank you for watching. But the problem is there's so many people watching things as opposed to doing things. There's always, Oliver, I'm sure you've seen these surveys of the human attention span is that of a goldfish. Well, if that's the case, why are people listening to 3-hour Joe Rogan podcasts or binge watching an 8-episode Netflix series in one day? I mean, so is it just false attention? Is it where you sort of mentioned something there about like putting the spotlight on the wrong things and sucking away time that could be spent on doing something that was either worthwhile or something that's good for you, your friends, and your family?
I think there's a couple of things to be said about distraction here. So the first is that we live, in a sort of an environment, an attention environment that is quite hostile to focusing on the things that you want to focus on. The whole world of social media and more is designed to sort of harvest as much attention as possible. So obviously there is this phenomenon where ultimately, some social networks are better than others, but ultimately all of those kinds of platforms want to keep you on the site as long as possible. That's the goal. Totally straightforward business goal. And the result is that they prioritize the things that keep you there, which might well be things that make you furious or things that make you laugh but are completely without substance and then make you feel like you just wasted an hour. And so you do have to sort of exercise some real personal, autonomy if you're not just going to fall into that whirlpool of distraction. But the other thing that I think doesn't get enough attention is that we sort of go along with it, right? We distract ourselves from the inside as well as being sort of distracted from the outside. When I'm writing something and then I end up apparently frittering away half an hour on Twitter or whatever, it's not because I was loving the writing and then the social media network kind of grabbed me against my will. Obviously, I was getting kind of antsy, and then I thought, it'd be more fun to do that. And I think what that sort of points to is that a lot of the stuff that actually we love to have in our lives, challenging work and deep relationships and all the rest of it, like it doesn't feel super great and comfortable, especially at first. And there are lots of reasons why in the moment we would prefer to go and like read about some completely pointless celebrity feud that's going to make no difference to our lives at all. So it's actually what's needed here, actually, to bring up another slightly cliched word, is a kind of mindfulness, right? It's kind of you sit down to do something that you want to do, or you sit down to have a conversation with your spouse, or you spend a few hours like paying attention to your kids or whatever it is, and you sort of expect that you learn to expect, this is what I think is important to do. You learn to expect that there'll be some restlessness there. There'll be some kind of like, well, I'd rather be distracting myself. As soon as you see it, you have a choice about whether to give in to it or not. But if you don't see it, you'll find yourself like, 2 hours later scrolling through Instagram with nothing to show for it.
It's funny too. I know the argument has always been it's a generational thing, like Gen Z and Gen Alpha, they're attached to their screens. But funny enough, Oliver, my wife and I were in a diner yesterday, and sitting across from us is an elderly couple, probably 80 plus. So the greatest generation, I think that's over boomer.
Right.
And they're both on their phones, their phones. So it's as much as the younger generations were born with the phone in their hand, the older generations have grown to be like, yeah, I like this stuff. I like these like endorphins I'm getting, and these the all the crap that your mental juices flow when you're on social media. So it is funny how we are so quick to blame like the younger generation, but man, it don't matter how old you are, you can get hooked on this stuff.
Oh, totally. There's a famous technology critic called Tristan Harris who says that every time you open up a social media network, a social media app, there are 1,000 people on the other side of the screen paid good San Francisco salaries to try to keep you there, right? This is not a fair fight. And so you really do have to put quite a bit of effort into looking after your attention. I think, it only gets more and more important. And we don't actually even help the rest of the world, right? Like many people who are more sort of pro-socially minded end up getting distracted all day long reading about politics or reading about war and suffering around the world. They have good motives a lot of the time, but that's not actually a way to help those issues. That's just just as much distraction as if it was celebrity news, really.
Right. And so that brings us to your latest book, Meditations for Mortals. I was getting a very much, because as I'm a middle-aged white guy, Oliver, so I'm all about stoicism these days. So I'm getting a very sort of stoic kind of through line through this about, one thing I always pull from stoicism: you control what you control. Don't, other people can't control how you feel, that kind of thing. How does your current philosophy play into what Meditations for Mortals is?
Well, I think Stoicism is definitely present in the book. I think Zen Buddhism is probably the other main influence. What I wanted to do in this book was to really dive into this question of why it's so easy to sort of know what you want to be doing with your time and how you want to be showing up for life, and then just like not to do it, not to actually do it. And so it's a book about crossing that gap, I think, from knowing to doing, but it's also meant to like have that effect, right? So I didn't want it to just be another system for people to read about and put on a shelf and forget about. So it's this sort of 4-week structure divided into 7 short chapters for each week. And, I certainly can't force anyone to read one a day, but that's kind of the idea. And what I'm trying to do, I think, is to sort of explore these ideas and help shift people's perspective in favor of sort of taking meaningful action, but right in the middle of their existing lives, right? So this is something that can just fold into the fact that you've got too many emails and a million projects on the go and 3 kids who need your attention. It's not about like, well, when I get weeks of time off, then I will finally turn my attention to this. So I'm trying to sort of undermine deliberately what I think is a problem with a lot of self-help, which is even if it's really good, it's something that one ends up reading about instead of actually implementing.
Yeah, I think my problem with a lot of personal development books out there is it's too much.
Yeah.
And sometimes you'll read this amazing work, whether it's something like The Tools or something like that, and be like, man, that was great. I feel like a better person, but blank, I don't remember any of it.
Right.
For me, Oliver, I can't ever like retain all of this stuff. So in a way, you're helping the people like me who are like, man, I'm never going to, as actors say, like, I'm not going to be off book. I'm not going to memorize this book. So the idea of you putting in these little sort of little nuggets is sort of helpful, I think, right?
I hope so. And, that's really part of it is that it's like, it's not to be retained. It's to be, if you do, say you do decide to read this book at that approximately at that rate of sort of a chapter a day, a little chapter at 5 minutes with your coffee or something. If there's something in that little chapter that resonates, it'll stick. It'll stick anyway. You don't need to like be writing it down and taking notes. And then maybe it'll change how you go through that day, just a tiny little bit. I think there's all sorts of potential for a more effective kind of personal change that comes from just just letting a book wash over you and see which bits naturally hang about.
And the title Meditations for Mortals, it is funny how, as much as we like to say the world's gone to hell in a handbasket, I mean, the world's pretty good. And the fact that, like, the term meditation, I remember growing up, again, card-carrying Gen Xer, the idea of someone meditating was like, look at this weirdo. What are they doing meditating? And now we've gotten to the point where meditation is, I mean, even healthcare and the doctors say meditation is good for you. So the evolution of man is a constant, and meditating is a big part of it. How do you, for someone who like maybe, and again, this is not about meditation per se, but like the idea of having that daily practice of quietness and stillness, do you embrace that? Do you try that? Any tips for that? Because I think, this whole conversation we've been talking about busyness and distractions, but how do we find stillness?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, it's not a book about meditation in the sense of sitting on a cushion and following your breath, although definitely the discussion in there of how to cultivate habits and things could definitely apply to that, to that practice. I think the thing that I want to say about that idea about finding stillness, and really about building any kind of habit for greater consciousness, for greater sort of presence in the present moment, anything else, is that we get too caught up in this idea of trying to kind of find the perfect schedule for it. We get too caught up in the idea of like, what's the ideal routine? Now I'm going to put this into practice every day for the rest of my life. I think there's an incredible benefit in learning, if you can, to sort of just let yourself do the thing once, right? So if it is meditating that you have wondered about, or if it is writing in a journal, or if it is taking a short walk each day or something, it's not about launching this whole new project where you're going to do it every day for the rest of your life, or even for 30 days, although that is a more manageable goal. It's just literally doing it once today, like just today, however imperfectly, however sort of falteringly, with no confidence that you'll necessarily ever come back and do it again, right? But just nonetheless being willing to do it. Because otherwise, and I found this from personal experience, actually trying to develop the good habits can become a weird kind of psychological barrier from doing those things, because you tell yourself that you're involved in this whole complicated thing where you're going to like add these habits to your life, and then 3 days in, it's all too much and you can't be bothered and you fall off the wagon and then you never get back on. If there's something that you want to be doing more of in your life, I think it is so powerful to be able to just like do it once, and then maybe tomorrow and maybe the next day, sure, and then you've got to practice and you're golden. But like, to just start from that perspective of, can I allow myself to just do this thing?
And speaking of setting rules for yourself, I'm a big fan of the golden rule, but you write about the rule of Saint Benedict. Tell me about that for the folks who are unfamiliar with.
Yeah, well, this was, I mean, the rule of Saint Benedict is the way in which lots and lots of monasteries and convents still organize their days today. It's like a rule book, really, of how to structure and run a religious community. But what's interesting about it to me, I'm not really religious, so it's not that, but it's that it's got this very, very interesting approach to being flexible, right? Because actually in the history of this, Saint Benedict was this monk who sort of was outraged by all the moral depravity he saw around him. So he set up all these kind of very strict monasteries where people had to follow incredibly rigid rules. And on 2 different occasions in his life, he was the victim of a poisoning attempt by monks who he was in authority over, because they sort of hated the rigidity of the rules that he was imposing on them. So then he wrote this thing called the rules that has become known as the rule of St. Benedict. And it's totally different. It's like, it's this incredibly kind of forgiving and flexible approach, which sort of says, look, we're dealing with humans here, and we'd like to get them to do certain things, but we better accept that we're dealing with humans. And there's a very actually funny passage in it, which about regulating the consumption of alcohol in monasteries, which says basically, I'm paraphrasing, but it says basically, ideally, monks would never drink beer, but apparently these days, and he's talking about like many centuries ago, apparently these days you can't get monks to stop drinking, so at least drink in moderation and don't get intoxicated, right? And it's hilarious in this ancient document to see this guy saying basically like, look, we're not perfect. It will be good not to have too much alcohol, but we've tried to get them to drink no alcohol and it doesn't work, so let's just leave that aside. And I think what's so interesting about this and what relevant to the sort of space of self-help and personal development is this rule has endured, this set of rules has endured for centuries. And I think what that tells you is that flexible rules that are not super rigid are far, far better and more sustainable, right? So for example, there's one I have in there about doing things daily-ish, right? If you tell yourself you've absolutely got to, I don't know, go for a run every single day, and that's your new plan, it's terrible when the first time you miss that because you're feeling sick or you just can't be bothered, like, then it's over, or you're incredibly depressed and feel like a loser. If you tell yourself you're going to do it daily-ish, or another rule that people are fond of these days, to never miss 2 days in a row, for example, like you've got this kind of, there's this give in the system, this slack in the system, and it's not self-indulgent. It's actually much sort of bolder because it's the thing that gets you to do the thing. It's very idealistic and sounds great to be like, okay, I'm going to do these 8 things every single day for the rest of my life. But it's meaningless if 3 days in, you stop doing them.
Yeah, it's sort of like New Year's resolutions. And it's funny, the rule of St. Benedict, it's almost like he's the guy who created don't get high on your own supply, right? It'd be just like, just take a little bit, but don't get too high on that.
Right.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. And the monks were very often brewing beer, actually. So it was their own supply. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. Good for them. That's awesome. It's amazing because the human body and mortals, we're so like, we make our lives so hard because, as you were talking, I was thinking about like my gym routine because years ago I was one of these CrossFit idiots. I would go to the gym, eat paleo. I ran a couple marathons. And during this time of my life, it was maybe like 5 to 8 years, I was like, I don't understand why people don't work out. Like, this is good. Why do you not do that? Fast forward a few years, the pandemic comes around. I don't feel like doing anything. And then I'm seeing like people, Pelotoning for hours and putting it on their Instagram. And I'm like, why do people got to work out like that? I don't get it. And now I'm back on my fitness routine where I sort of like your rule of 2 days, like I don't go 2 days without working out. But is there any way to explain us, Oliver? We are so fucking nuts.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. And what it really adds up to, I think, is the real limits of our willpower or our intellect in making these things work, right? You have to work with who you are and where you're at in life, and you have to sort of go with that and figure out the best thing to do with that rather than have this kind of like, here's the plan and I'm going to force it into reality come what may.
And I want to wrap things up by talking about squeezing it in. So last week my wife had a minor medical procedure, and it was scheduled for 10 a.m. that morning. At 7 o'clock that day, the doctor's office calls and they say, hey, listen, can you guys come now? This is 3 hours before the procedure, early in the morning. I'm like, well, we can come now, but we could probably get there by 9 o'clock. And they're like, okay, cool. If you're here by 9:30, it should be fine. Great. So we rush around. My wife's like just got out of the shower. She's running. We get to the office. I take a seat in the waiting room. She goes into the office, and all of a sudden she comes out and she says, the procedure was canceled. I'm like, what do you mean the procedure was canceled? Like, oh, the doctor had to leave. That's why they wanted us to get here earlier. So because I'm the stoic in me is like, all right, well, there's nothing I could do about this, but the only thing I can do is like ask why, how did this happen? So I go to the office manager and I say, I totally understand personal things happen, things get in the way, but why on God's green earth did you have us rush here so then the person would have to leave anyway? The person at the desk goes, oh yeah, the doctor tried to squeeze in the procedure before he had to leave. And I use this example of like this idea of us trying to squeeze things in. And I think on the top of the list, you don't want to squeeze in, Oliver, and you'll probably agree with me on this, is squeezing in medical procedures. Let's not do that. But this idea of doing it, because I feel like when you're squeezing something in, you're telling someone, I've got two way more important things, but I'm going to try to slot you in between those important things. Tell me about your thoughts on squeezing things in.
Well, yeah, there is that kind of interpersonal side of it, isn't there? It's kind of rude to be the person who's being squeezed in, and I feel for your experiences. There's also just the general sense in which we feel that it's a sensible thing to do somehow, to try to fit more and more things into our schedule than we currently have in them. And yeah, it's a recipe for disaster, because here's the thing, you're never going to get, that doctor is never going to get to the point where he feels or she feels on top of all the things, right? Squeezing a couple more things in, even if it hadn't inconvenienced you in the way it did, was not going to lead to this wonderful golden plateau of now there's time for everything. And I think that's really the move that I'm focusing on a lot in a lot of my writing, is like, okay, what if we just accepted that there was always going to be too much to do? What would we choose to focus on then, instead of trying to fit everything in, because that's never happening.
And this has been great conversation, Oliver. If folks want to find out more about helping their time management skills, just becoming better people, where's the best introduction to Oliver Burkeman?
Well, my website, oliverburkeman.com, has all the information, and my email newsletter. It is the books, especially the recent book, the new book. That's the best way to support my work if you're interested in doing so, yeah.
Oliver, thanks again for the time. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
And that's going to do it for this episode of Good Listen. Thank you so much for spending some time with me. If you have a moment, I would greatly appreciate it if you hit that thumbs up button. It's a small gesture, but it really helps my channel. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, feel free to leave a 5-star review. That'd be nice. I'd dig that. Thank you so much for doing that. And if you want to connect with me, want to find me on social media, want to shoot me a note, just go to joepardavila.com. Thanks again for spending some time with me. I will see you next time. Adios.